Richard I of England, more widely remembered as Richard the Lionheart, gained his epithet because of his reputation as a fearless warrior and accomplished military leader. Born on September 8, 1157 at Beaumont Palace in Oxford, he was the third of the 5 sons of King Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine. Although not expected to inherit the throne, the deaths of his older brother placed him in the line for kingship. Beyond England, he held a vast collection of titles including Duke of Normandy, Aquitaine and Gascony, Count of Poitiers, Anjou, Maine, and Nantes, Lord of Cyprus, and Overlord of Brittany. His rule as king lasted from 1189 until his death in 1199, but he spent little of that time in England, focusing instead on war, crusade, and defense of his continental territories. At the age of 16, Richard had already taken command of his own army, suppressing uprisings in Poitou against his father. His reputation as a crusader was cemented during the Third Crusade, where he became the principal Christian commander after Philip II of France returned home. Though he achieved victories against Saladin and displayed tactical brilliance, he was ultimately forced to abandon the hope of retaking Jerusalem. He was a man of culture as well as war, composing poetry and writing in both French and Occitan, though it is uncertain how much English he ever spoke or understood. Richard spent most of his adult life in Aquitaine and, after becoming king, devoted only a few months of his reign to England itself. This gave rise to later criticism that he treated the kingdom merely as a source of funds for his campaigns. Earlier generations celebrated him as a model king and a pious hero, while more recent historians have sought a more balanced view of his reign, questioning the traditional absent king narrative. His image endures both in England and in France, and he is remembered more commonly by his epithet than by his regnal number. Richard's early years were shaped by the complex dynastic politics of the Angevin dynasty. He was considered his mother's favored child, and through her he inherited Aquitaine. His father Henry II, descendant of William the Conqueror, traced his family's lineage to the Anglo-Saxon kings and even further through the legends to figures like Noah and the mythical Melusine. Richard likely spent his earliest years in England, raised by a nurse named Hoidnierda of St. Albans, whom he later rewarded generously. His first journey to the continent came in 1165, when his mother brought him to Normandy. By 1171, Richard was traveling with Eleanor and Aquitaine, attempting to secure loyalty from the local nobility, and the following year he was formally invested as Duke of Aquitaine and Count of Poitou. Marriage alliances were central to his political world. Early plans linked him with the daughters of Ramon Berenguer IV of Barcelona, though these arrangements fell apart. Another potential union with Alice, daughter of Louis VII of France, became mired in the rivalry between the Plantagenets and the French crown. By 1169, however, a peace treaty confirmed his betrothal to Alice, and he paid homage to the French king for his inheritance of Aquitaine. Henry II's plan to divide his territories among his 3 eldest sons gave Richard control of Aquitaine. His elder brother, Henry the Young King, dominion over England, Normandy, Anjou, and Maine, and Geoffrey the Duchy of Brittany through marriage. This division set the stage for bitter rivalries and shifting loyalties that would define much of Richard's life and career. In 1173, Henry the Young King rebelled against his father Henry II, demanding real authority over the lands he had been promised instead of remaining dependent on his father's control. Some chroniclers suggested that Eleanor of Aquitaine may have encouraged her sons to rise against Henry. The young king fled to the French court where Louis VII welcomed him. Richard and Geoffrey soon joined their brother, while John, still a child, stayed in England. Louis not only offered them protection but also knighted Richard, cementing their ties of loyalty. At the French court, the 3 brothers swore not to negotiate with Henry II without the approval of Louis and his barons. With Louis's backing, the rebels gained support from influential nobles, including Philip of Flanders, who received promises of money and castles. In England, a parallel uprising began under Robert de Beaumont, Earl of Leicester, supported by the Earl of Norfolk and Chester, as well as King William of Scotland. The revolt quickly spread, and by mid-1173, rebel forces were laying siege to towns in Normandy and Brittany. Richard returned to Poitou, rallying barons loyal to himself and Eleanor. When Eleanor was captured, Richard had to carry on the fight alone, operating from Saintes after a failed attempt to seize La Rochelle. Henry II reacted by assembling a massive force of mercenaries, numbering more than 20,000. His campaign forced Louis to retreat, retook Brittany, and recovered Dole. Although Henry offered peace terms, his sons refused on the advice of Louis. When Henry's troops captured Saintes, Richard escaped and took refuge in Château de Taillebourg, where he remained until the end of the war. Meanwhile, Henry crushed the English rebellion, defeating William of Scotland and Hugh Bagog in July 1174. Louis eventually abandoned the conflict and a peace agreement was signed at Montlouis that September. The truce excluded Richard, and left isolated, he submitted to his father at Poitiers, throwing himself at Henry's feet in tears. Soon after, his brothers also reconciled. Yet the terms were harsh. Richard received only 2 castles and part of Aquitaine's revenues, far less than what he had once been offered. Eleanor, however, remained a prisoner until Henry's death, a guarantee of Richard's obedience. Following the rebellion, Richard returned to Aquitaine to punish the nobles who had joined him. Many castles were ordered dismantled and returned to their former state. Richard gained a reputation for relentless sieges, such as the Castellan-sur-Agen, where his machines forced surrender after weeks of resistance. It was during these campaigns that he earned the sobriquet the Lion for his bravery and martial skill. Chroniclers later described him as their lion, and the title Lionheart became permanently attached to his name. Still, Henry II continued to mistrust his sons. Rumors circulated that he had taken Alice of France, Richard's betrothed, as his mistress, making their marriage impossible while retaining her dowry lands. Richard could not easily renounce Alice, since she was the sister of Philip II of France. In Aquitaine, Richard's heavy-handed rule sparked new uprisings. In 1179, rebels challenged his authority with the support of Henry and Geoffrey. At Taillebourg, Richard broke their resistance through brutal tactics, cutting off supplies and devastating the countryside. When the defenders sailed out, he defeated them and stormed the castle, quickly bringing the revolt to an end. His decisive victory forced many barons into submission, yet his reputation for cruelty deepened, particularly after campaigns in Angoulême and Limousin. By the early 1180s, Henry II demanded that Richard pay homage to the young king, but Richard refused. Tensions escalated, and in 1183, open war broke out as Henry the young king and Geoffrey attacked Aquitaine. Richard fought fiercely, executing prisoners and refusing to yield. The conflict abruptly ended when the young king died that summer, leaving Richard the eldest surviving son and heir to the throne. Henry II, however, attempted to strip Richard of Aquitaine and assign it to John. Richard resisted and the quarrel persisted. After Geoffrey's sudden death in 1186, Richard's position grew stronger. By 1187, he allied with the young French king Philip II, who sought to weaken Henry. Their partnership alarmed Henry II, especially when Richard seized his father's treasure at Chinon and fortified his castle at Poitou. Some records suggest that Richard and Philip's closeness led to speculation of intimacy, though other historians interpret their shared bed during a diplomatic visit as symbolic of political unity rather than anything else. The news of the Crusader defeat at Hattin inspired Richard to take the cross, publicly committing to a crusade. In 1188, he formally acknowledged Philip as his overlord in exchange for support against Henry. The final confrontation came in 1189, when Richard and Philip's armies defeated Henry's forces at Valence. Henry was forced to recognize Richard as his heir. 2 days later, the king died at Chinon, and Richard succeeded him as King of England, Duke of Normandy, and Count of Anjou. Chroniclers later claimed that Henry's corpse bled at Richard's presence, seen as a sign of guilt or divine judgment. Richard was formally invested as Duke of Normandy on July 20, 1189, and only weeks later, on September 3rd, crowned King of Westminster Abbey. In keeping with tradition, Jews and women were excluded from the ceremony, but some Jewish leaders appeared to present gifts to the new ruler. Their presence caused an uproar. According to chroniclers, Richard's courtiers assaulted them, stripping and flogging them before driving them out. Rumors spread that the king had ordered a massacre of Jews, and mobs in London turned on the Jewish community. Homes were set on fire, possessions were looted, and many were forced to accept baptism. Some found refuge in the Tower of London, while others fled. Among the victims was Jacob of Orleans, a well-known scholar. Although Richard punished some of the rioters and even allowed a man who had been forcibly baptized to return to his faith, violence persisted. Concerned that such unrest might destabilize his kingdom before his departure for crusade, he executed those responsible for the worst crimes and issued orders to protect Jewish communities. Despite this, anti-Jewish violence flared again the following spring. most notably in the bloody massacre at York in March 1190. Richard had already vowed to take the cross in 1187 after the fall of Jerusalem to Saladin, and once king, he renewed his commitment. Both he and Philip of France agreed to join the Third Crusade, each worried that the other might seize his lands during his absence. Richard raised immense funds to finance this expedition. He emptied much of his father's treasury, imposed new taxes, and even sold offices, lands, and privileges to the highest bidders. To secure money, he even released William of Scotland from vassalage in exchange for a huge payment, and he famously quipped that he would have sold London itself if he could have found a buyer. On the continent, he confirmed and replaced key officials, reshaping the administration of Normandy, Anjou, Poitou, and Gascony before leaving his continental possessions under guard. He appointed William Longchamp as his chief regent in England, a decision that sparked resentment from his brother John, who began intriguing against him. In September 1190, Richard and Philip arrived in Sicily, where political upheaval had followed the death of King William II. His cousin Tancred had seized the throne, imprisoning William's widow Joan, who happened to be Richard's sister, and withholding her inheritance. Richard demanded her release and compensation. When Tancred delayed, Richard attacked Messina, stormed the city on the 4th of October, and established a base there. The occupation angered Philip, and tensions grew between the two kings. Eventually, in March 1191, a treaty was signed. Joan received gold as compensation. Arthur of Brittany was named Richard's heir, and Tancred promised his daughter in marriage to Arthur. The agreement eased tensions, but mistrust lingered. Richard also ended his betrothal of Alice, Philip's sister, further straining relations. During his stay, he even met the abbot Joachim of Fiore, who spoke to him of apocalyptic prophecies. When Richard finally set sail for the Holy Land in April 1191, his fleet of 17,000 was scattered by storms. Some ships wrecked on the shores of Cyprus, where survivors, including Richard's sisters and his betrothed Berengaria of Navarre, were taken captive by Isaac Komnenos, the island's ruler. Richard landed at Lemesos on May 1st and demanded their release. When Isaac refused, Richard attacked, seizing the city and swiftly conquering the entire island within a month. Isaac surrendered and was bound with silver chains, as Richard had promised not to use iron. Richard placed the island under governors and later sold it to the Knights of Templar, from whom it passes to Guy of Lusignan. Cyprus became a crucial Christian stronghold in the eastern Mediterranean and remained so until the Ottoman conquest centuries later. The rapid victory enhanced Richard's reputation and added to his financial resources. Before departing Cyprus, Richard married Berengaria of Navarre on May 12, 1191, in the chapel of St. George at Lemesos. The union, celebrated with great ceremony and festivities, had been encouraged by Eleanor of Aquitaine to secure Aquitaine's southern frontier and bring Navarre into alliance. The marriage, however, produced no children. Berengaria accompanied Richard briefly on the crusade, but later returned separately, and she never set foot in England until after his death. Richard, though occasionally expressing regret for neglecting her, never lived with his wife again after his release from captivity in Germany. Richard reached the city of Acre on June 8, 1191, where he threw his support behind Guy of Lusignan, his vassal from Poitou. Guy, who had lost his wife Sibylla of Jerusalem during the long siege, sought to maintain his claim to the throne of Jerusalem. His position was challenged by Conrad of Montferrat, husband of Sibylla's half-sister Isabella. Conrad had famously defended Tyre against Saladin in 1187 and was supported by Philip of France and Leopold of Australia. Richard also allied with Humphrey of Touraine, Isabella's former husband, who was loyal to Guy and fluent in Arabic, making him a useful negotiator. Despite suffering from serious illness, Richard personally contributed to the fall of Acre. At one point, while bedridden with disease, he was carried on a litter wrapped in a silk quilt, using a crossbow to fire on defenders along the walls. When the city finally surrendered, Conrad negotiated the terms with Saladin. The victory was followed by quarrels. Richard clashed with Leopold after his men tore down the Austrian banner raised beside those of England and France, an insult that drove Leopold from the crusade. Philip of France, increasingly ill and at odds with Richard over Cyprus and the succession to Jerusalem, soon returned home as well, leaving Richard the dominant leader. Richard inherited thousands of Muslim prisoners from the surrender of Acre, but fearing his army would be hampered if forced to guard them, he ordered their execution. Soon afterward, he marched south and won a decisive victory of Arsuf on September 7, 1191. Saladin's forces tried to provoke the Crusaders into breaking formation, but Richard held his lines firm until the Hospitallers launched a charge. At that point, Richard ordered a counterattack that routed the Muslim army. The triumph at Arsuf restored Crusader morale, though it did not destroy Saladin's strength. By November, the army reached Bet Nuba, only 12 miles from Jerusalem, but heavy winter weathers and fears of entrapment forced them to retreat. Negotiations with Saladin failed, and Richard instead refortified Ascalon in early 1191. Politics within the Crusader ranks soon forced Richard to recognize Conrad as king of Jerusalem, while Guy was compensated with Cyprus. Yet before Conrad could be crowned, he was murdered in the streets of Tyre by members of the Assassins. Suspicion fell heavily on Richard, though no proof was ever found. Within days, Isabella, Conrad's widow, married Henry of Champagne, Richard's own nephew. With Jerusalem still out of reach, the Crusader army split over strategy. Richard and many others favored an attack on Egypt, the base of Saladin's power, while the French lords insisted on a direct assault of Jerusalem. Richard declared that he would fight as a simple soldier, but refused to lead, and without unity the army could only retreat to the coast. Skirmishes continued through 1192, including another major clash at Jaffa, where Richard's bold charge impressed even his enemies. Chroniclers recorded that he rode the length of Saladin's line alone, and not a single Muslim soldier dared break ranks to face him. Still, both sides knew the war was unsustainable. Saladin insisted on dismantling Ascalon, and Richard faced urgent news of plots in Europe by his brother John and Philip of France. On September 2, 1192, Richard and Saladin agreed to a truce. Ascalon's fortification would be destroyed, Christians would retain coastal strongholds, and pilgrims and merchants would have free access to Jerusalem. Richard, ill and exhausted, sailed home in October. His journey back proved disastrous. Storms forced his ship to seek shelter near Corfu, angering the Byzantine Emperor Isaac II, whose territory Richard had seized when he took Cyprus. Disguised as a Templar knight, he tried to cross Europe, but near Vienna he was seized by Leopold of Austria, still furious over the insult of Acre, and convinced Richard had a hand in Conrad's murder. The English king was confined at Durmstein Castle, guarded by Leopold's minister, Hadmar of Cunring. News of his capture spread slowly to England, where for weeks his exact fate was uncertain. While in prison, Richard composed a song written in both French and Aquitaine, lamenting his betrayal and abandonment. In March 1193, he was handed over to Emperor Henry IV, who moved him to Trifles Castle. The emperor had grievances of his own. Richard had supported the Welf dynasty against the imperial house and had recognized Tancred's rule in Sicily, which conflicted with Henry's claims. Henry demanded an enormous ransom of 150,000 marks, roughly 2 to 3 times the English crown's annual income. To secure this, England was heavily taxed, church treasures were seized, and Eleanor of Aquitaine herself led the effort to raise funds. At the same time, John and Philip of France offered Henry money to keep Richard captive until at least late 1194. Henry refused their offer, but Richard's imprisonment dragged on. Conditions worsened under the influence of Philip of Dreux, Bishop of Uvaise and cousin of the French king. And Richard was even chained in irons so heavy that, in his own words, a beast of burden would have struggled to carry them. Despite these hardships, Eleanor succeeded in collecting the ransom. Finally, in February 1194, after more than a year in captivity, Richard was released. On hearing the news, Philip of France sent a warning to John. "Look to yourself, the devil is loose." Shortly afterward, Leopold died, and under papal pressure, his successor abandoned any plans to marry Richard's niece, Eleanor of Brittany. Richard was free at last, but his troubles were far from over. While Richard was held captive, his brother John allied with Philip of France and attempted to seize power. Philip managed to capture parts of Normandy, including the strategically important Vexin. Yet when Richard finally returned in 1194, he forgave John and confirmed him as his heir in place of their nephew Arthur. To erase the humiliation of his imprisonment, Richard was crowned once again on March 11, 1194 at Winchester. Richard immediately turned his attention to reclaiming lost lands in Normandy. The fall of Château de Gisors in 1193 had left a dangerous gap in the duchy's defenses. To counter this, he chose a dramatic cliff-top site above the River Seine at Andeli, despite an earlier treaty forbidding fortification there. When Archbishop Walter of Rouen refused to sell the land, Richard seized it outright, even against church opposition. An interdict was declared over Normandy, halting religious services and leaving bodies unburied in the streets. Only after Richard compensated the archbishop and granted new lands, including the valuable port of Dieppe, was the interdict lifted. On this site rose Château Galliard, Richard's greatest architectural achievement. Construction began in 1196, and within 2 years the fortress was largely complete, an extraordinary pace when most castles of similar scale required a decade. The cost was immense, estimated at $15,000 to $20,000, far exceeding what he ever spent on castles in England. Chroniclers marveled at the stronghold, and later historians described it as one of the finest in Europe, ahead of its time in both design and defensive innovations. Richard was so closely involved that some believe he personally directed the work. The castle became his favored residence in his final years, a symbol of his determination to resist French encroachment. Determined to confront Philip II, Richard built a wide coalition of allies. He secured the support of Baldwin of Flanders, Renaud of Boulogne, and his father-in-law Sancho de Navarre. He also helped his nephew, son of Henry the Lion, gain recognition as Otto IV of Germany, strengthening the Plantagenet position in Europe. His campaigns brought him success. At Fredeval in 1194, Philip fled in disorder, leaving his entire royal archive in Richard's hands. 4 years later, at the Battle of Gisors, Richard's forces triumphed again. It was after this victory that Richard adopted Dieu et mon droit, God in my right, a motto still used by the English monarchy. In March 1199, Richard was suppressing rebellion at Limousin, where Viscount Aymar of Limoges had risen against him. Though it was Lent, Richard devastated the countryside and besieged the small castle of Calais-Cambrai. Chroniclers claim the dispute arose over a hidden hoard of ancient gold discovered by a peasant. On March 26, while inspecting the siege, Richard was struck in the shoulder by a crossbow bolt. The wound became infected, turning gangrenous. As death approached, he ordered that the crossbowman be brought before him. Accounts vary of the man's name, but most describe him as a youth who declared he sought revenge for the deaths of his father and brothers. Expecting execution, he was instead pardoned by Richard, who ordered that he be freed and even given money. Yet after Richard's death, the mercenary captain Mercadier ignored the king's final act of mercy and had the boy brutally executed. Richard died on April 6, 1199 in the arms of his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine. His passing inspired the saying that the lion was slain by the ant. His body was divided for burial, his heart placed in Rouen Cathedral, his entrails interred at Chalice where he died, and the rest of his remains laid beside his father at Fontevraud Abbey. Modern analysis of his preserved heart revealed traces of frankincense and other substances, linking his embalming symbolically with the life of Christ. Richard left no legitimate children. He acknowledged only one illegitimate son, Philip of Cognac. His brother John succeeded him as king, though many of Richard's French lands favored his nephew Arthur instead. This dispute marked the beginning of the collapse of the Angevin Empire. Despite his flaws, Richard's courage, military genius, and monumental works such as Château Galliard secured his place in history as one of the most celebrated warrior kings of the Middle Ages.